Hey guys, this is Josh from the Wander Lounge. Today I'm going to talk a bit about an article that was published recently looking at schoolies from the perspective of someone who owns or is considering owning a commercial RV. This article is written by Kendall Jennings, and I'll put a link to it in the video description. For the sake of this discussion, I'll assume that you know a little bit about RVs but don't really know much about schoolies. This article came off as kind of weird to me, but it's geared towards beginners, and I think maybe some commentary and clarification is helpful. With that in mind, let's get started. The pros and cons of living in a schoolie. The article starts off mentioning how popular schoolies are on social media. For sure this is true, but maybe not for the reasons the author says. There are absolutely some Instagram users out there who are sharing the sort of overproduced stage photos we've come to expect in the social media era, but we all know doesn't often represent reality. There will always be that audience of dreamers who like the idea and all, but will never take that first step, and for them they don't really need realism because it's just an escape. But for every one of them, there's 100 people posting a way less polished, way more realistic log of adventures, their successes, and their failures. And that's where the value comes in, getting to see what regular people with regular skills and regular budgets and regular lives are able to accomplish, and that accessibility is one of the big draws to a schoolie. They also mention that motivation for building a schoolie might come from an emotional attachment to school buses from when they were a kid. I'm not going to say that never happens, but I only know one person who that's true for, and he's a super cool dude with several super cool buses, so shout out to Christopher for that. So the next note in the article is that schoolies are mobile. This seems a bit weird when we're comparing with RVs, because they're supposed to be mobile too, right? I have some experience with commercial RVs, and while they might not be my favorite, they do move. He also mentions being self-sufficient, which again I don't think is something specific to schoolies either. Water tanks on your bus aren't functionally different from water tanks in a toy hauler. Next, they talk a bit about size. As they mention, a full-size bus in the US can be quite long, up to 40 feet, but a Class A can be as long as 45 feet, and a truck and trailer combo can be as long as 65 feet. Also, while buses are pretty much all 90 inches wide, most RVs will be 102 inches wide. In most circumstances, the schoolie will be much more casual to drive. The author also mentions licenses, but again, those requirements aren't specific to a schoolie, and you need to do the same due diligence as you would if you were buying a commercially produced motorhome. Unfortunately, those rules vary by state, but the sort of restrictions you'll find are based on the vehicle's rated weight and passenger capacity. In Canada, they even want an endorsement for a vehicle that has air brakes. Here in Florida, the only restriction I needed to worry about was passenger capacity, where anything that can carry 16 people is considered a commercial vehicle regardless of its actual use. Now they list a con: space. This kind of goes without saying, your space inside can't be bigger than your space outside. Again, not a unique thing to a schoolie, but let's throw them a bone and say that any self-built motorhome is going to require some effort to get all of your functionality into the available space. Anyone into cars or motorsports knows the line, there's no replacement for displacement, and it applies the same here when talking about building a living area with limited space. But the challenges are made to be overcome, and this isn't some new problem. Tiny houses, sailboats, commercial RVs, dense housing, they've all had to deal with this and managed to be successful. So the reality of a school bus is you lose some space for things like the driver's area, the engine bay, and the thick walls. In a flat-nosed engine bus like mine, that's about 4 feet of length lost since the engine is under the floor. On a dog-nosed bus, you're losing more like 10 feet since the engine is in front of the driver. But for total space, as an example, a 40-foot front engine bus will give you about 234 square feet of total living space. My bus, being 32-foot total length, flat nose, front engine, gives us about 182 square feet. This is also one of the areas people tend to get stuck on, where they see a bus as this great big behemoth to drive and go with something small. Not always, but quite often, that ends up being a starter bus and they eventually upgrade to something with more space. Kind of similar with vans, which are also super popular, but things get sketchy when you start trying to figure out how to fit a shower or carry more than a couple days of water. It can be done, but not a lot of people are doing it. One thing they mentioned that I absolutely do agree with is multiple use spaces. The easy example is for your dining area, work area, and entertaining area to be the same area. After all, a chair is a chair and a table is a table, right? Okay, the next item is another pro: unlimited design options. Most people build their own bus, and while they may borrow ideas from people, they're really making a space specific to their goals and needs. There are a few really high level layout ideas, such as keeping the center aisle as the path all the way through the bus, but when you get to any level of detail, you're not likely to find two buses that are all that similar. This is a big contrast to a commercial RV, where they'll build 20,000 of them and they're all identical. And there are some real advantages to that concept that for sure will convince some people to not go with a Skoolie. Not everybody has that itch to do all the things themselves the way that they want it, and they just want something easy and ready to use. You probably already know which side of that line you're on, of course. I don't think I need to elaborate more on this point because while it's a brief description of a huge topic, I think it's pretty fair. Now here's the big one that is worth spending some time on. Maintenance costs. To be fair to them, let's separate maintenance and repairs. I'm not the guy who's going to tell you that you can take your bus to Jiffy Lube and get out for $50 for an oil change, because that's just not reality. What is reality is that your typical big bus is based on a medium-duty truck chassis using medium-duty truck parts and is prescribed a medium-duty truck maintenance routine. Your diesel engine isn't going to take 5 quarts of oil, it's going to be more like 5 gallons of oil. And if you have someone else do it, it's going to cost you $300 or more. On the flip side, you can do it yourself for about a third that cost, and it isn't any more complex than changing the oil on an old pickup truck. One of the big areas where medium-duty truck platforms differ from what you may be used to with a car is their expected service life. A school bus is expected to start up every morning and every afternoon during the coldest months of the year and dutifully carry literal tons of machine and precious cargo to school and back. That's not an easy job to do, and it's not a job where you can just skip a day. As such, it's a major priority for manufacturers to make sure that maintenance is easy, accessible, and affordable. The most common service is the oil change, and it's not a challenge to complete it in under 15 minutes. Now, the second part of that, let's talk about repairs. Everything I mentioned in the last bit still holds true. You generally expect repairs to be pretty straightforward, mostly using common and available parts, and not a lot of surprises. All your normal stuff like brake parts, alternators, water pumps, fuel injectors, that's all stuff you can get at your local Napa or even at the discount guys like AutoZone, Advance, and O'Reilly's. Is your 350 amp alternator for your big bus going to cost more than the 65 amp alternator for your car? Maybe. Probably most of the time. But at least you're getting more power for your money, right? So what about major repairs? The kind of thing people junk their cars over. This is where I bring up something people don't often like to talk about, and that's the reality of mechanical things. In this amazing universe, one of the few things we can say for sure is that nothing lasts forever. Even when that thing is a big diesel engine, even when it's the top of the line model with the highest longevity rating and is the one everyone has on the top of their list. Sometimes unlikely things happen, but when they do, your avenues aren't much different than they are from the much more frequent occurrence of the engine in your car going bad. It's a bitter pill to swallow, of course, but again, these things are made to be maintained, they're made to be repaired, and they're made to be rebuilt or replaced. The article does allude to the cost savings of doing work yourself, and I stress to people that they should do as much as possible themselves. Not just for the cost savings, which are substantial, but also because every time you crawl under your bus, you're more familiar with it than you were last time, and that can only be a positive. Alright, so the next item is listed as a pro, and that's availability. And again, it's a complicated topic. The used bus market is weird in general, and it's extra weird right now. You can't just go down to any car lot and see a bus parked next to a Jetta, but more and more you can find them for sale on Craigslist or Facebook. Just a few years ago, the primary way to get a bus was at auction, and you could get a lot of bus for your dollar that way. But that market has changed. For one thing, the whole COVID mess that shut down schools also shut down their bus fleets. So you've got a year or two where buses just weren't being retired, but demand for them was shooting up. You've got the rising popularity of used bus dealers who have an inventory of buses you can look at on their lot, but they really just got it from the same auction you could have gotten it from, and charge a premium sometimes 3 or 4 times the auction price for that privilege. And lately, even individuals will buy a bus speculatively, hoping to flip it to an unwitting person at a huge profit. Not to mention the more and more common story of someone who bought a bus, took out the seats, then decided they didn't want to do it anymore, but that their bus was now worth twice as much as they paid for it since the seats are out. It's weird, man. When we first started, the idea of spending $5,000 for a bus meant you were looking at a premium bus in great shape with low miles and cool features. But most people were spending about $2,000. Now those premium buses are 10, 12, 15,000, and the typical setups often go for 5,000 or more. Not to mention, there's a lot that goes into picking a bus to buy. You can't just say school bus and expect you're getting something that meets your travel needs. That's a big conversation for another time, though. I'm honestly not sure how much I agree with availability as being a pro in today's market, and that bugs me. The next one is another con: window and seat removal. First things first, your seats need to come out, and there's a dozen ways to do it, not all of which are good. I tell people if you give me a bus and a buddy, I can have all the seats out in about half an hour. Granted, I've done that job a few times, but they're held in with bolts, and bolts can be removed. A cordless impact inside the bus and a wrench underneath makes quick work out of most buses. Sometimes you'll need to try a different method because you can't get to the nut underneath, but the vast majority of seats on the vast majority of buses are no big deal. As far as disposal goes, steel is always recyclable, and you might keep a couple of them to reupholster and use as part of your build, or even to use some of the steel for building undercarriage storage or who knows what else. Then there's the windows. Where you live and where you expect to be will dictate how important it is to handle them. If you're in a moderate climate all year where you don't really have those temperature extremes, maybe you just leave them. But maybe you aren't and you need to deal with them. Removing them and plating over the holes is always an option, but it's not the only option. We love when we can actually use our windows, so we seal them off with foam inserts to keep the outside temperature outside and the inside temperature inside. Those inserts pop right out when not needed, and we've even built window screens so we don't have to worry about the cat escaping through an open window to go catch a squirrel. They continue to discuss insulation, of course, but let's be honest here. We're talking about building a house inside a metal box. You shouldn't be surprised to hear that insulation is a thing that you need to do. Is it a con? It's a step that needs to be done, just like all the other steps that need to be done. So I don't know. So the last point they make, I'm going to enthusiastically agree with, and it's undeniably the part that I love the most. The Skoolie community is a huge pro. We're really fortunate to have met several great friends early in our journey, and that's just been a theme ever since. We're part of a really awesome community started by some really awesome people, and we've been doing events in that groups a few times a year. We even had our wedding at one of their events. I could go on and on about this, but really see for yourself by joining Skoolie Swarm on Facebook. We've also been doing tiny house shows and a few other gatherings around the country, and they're always amazingly positive experiences, especially when people coming for a tour are asking the tough questions to figure out if this is the right thing for them or not. Meeting curious people at a show and then seeing them a few months later at a gathering will always make me smile. Anyway, that's it for the article. I hope you found this perspective helpful and informative, and for sure click the link to read the original article as well. I'm working on a few other videos specifically geared towards new folks, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss those. If you like this video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and as always, we try to answer as many questions or comments left below. Be well, and we'll see you next time.